The Seeking Eye Life Exploration podcast is and will always be free to access. But if you would like to support my work, please consider joining my Patreon or signing up on YouTube as a channel member. By doing so, you will receive exclusive benefits, including early access to future podcast episodes, access to hosted discussion groups, and access to non-podcast supplementary videos. So click the join button underneath this video to join as a YouTube channel member, or find the link to my Patreon page in the description. Thank you.
I'm Liam Breck. I'm an amateur philosopher. My background is I was an internet inventor working in the messaging space for many years. I have been a philosopher in training since maybe the early 2000s without kind of realizing it. Just developed an interest in the natural sciences and philosophy and human sciences, and then more recently, superphysical phenomena. So out of the blue, I was invited to be on a UFO podcast a few months ago, completely unexpectedly. And in putting together an outline of what I wanted to say there, I realized I have all these thoughts. So I'm working on what I call empirical metaphysics, and so metaphysics is the there's maybe many ways to define it, but the way I would define it is that we would like to know the nature of the cosmos, of the world, of our locale in the world, and maybe the purpose of human lives and human institutions. In order to build a culture, which we just do naturally, some of that happens just automatically. But traditionally, so empirical metaphysics it differs from the other two kinds of metaphysics, which are traditional metaphysics, which we get from culture and spirituality or religion, and what you might call academic metaphysics, which is the kind which is pursued by professional philosophers. So traditional metaphysics goes back many thousands of years, and academic metaphysics dates to, in our current lineage, to the era of the Enlightenment. Descartes is one of the earliest philosophers in that vein. But it traces its heritage back to ancient Greece, particularly Plato and Aristotle. So the project of empirical metaphysics is to say, like, okay, we have all this data from the natural sciences and data from the human sciences. And we have all this scholarly work on superphysical phenomena. So afterlife studies, parapsychology, looking into psi phenomena, shamanism, etc. So what happens if you bring all of the possibly relevant data together and try to make a synthesis and see what kinds of interpretations might fall out? So that's what I'm calling empirical metaphysics. And this is like way beyond one person's ability. So in order for this to be successful, this would have to be a collective, multidisciplinary, scholarly effort happening over decades or even centuries. So I don't claim any special knowledge, any special insights. I'm just trying to pull together data and see what occurs to me, and encouraging other people to do the same. So any opinions that I state are provisional, and will possibly be shown to be wrong down the road. That has to be our initial stance. And then another important thing to keep in mind is that there's pretty good evidence from the superphysical world that embodied human being, embodied human cognition and perception are extremely constrained. Unbelievably, the number of beings or things that we cannot perceive or cannot get our heads around is just astonishing. So we should assume that all of our intellectual achievements in our world to date make up a tiny slice of the larger cosmos. And we shouldn't assume that we can necessarily get to ultimate reality. the project of metaphysics, since it cannot actually get to ultimate reality, should probably like try to find wisdom, basically, to try to make individual people's lives better. We can't reform society; that's been tried. And if we can't understand reality, what can we do? Well, we can try to give people tools to make their loved ones' lives better.
Sure. Now, trying to employ such a metaphysics, many would argue, is taking for granted or begging the question that the knowledge gained from the superphysical phenomena is assuming that the superphysical phenomena is real, and many would argue against that. So what evidence do you think is strong enough to say that we need to take these superphysical phenomena into account when developing such a metaphysics?
So it's not my role as a philosopher to discern what might be wrong or not with any particular body of research. We have to assume that scholarly research has been done in good faith and shows what it claims to show, especially when it's been reproduced over and over again and studied by dozens of researchers over decades or more than a century. So I don't spend time considering how to refute skepticism. That's other people do that way better than I could and have done for years. So my project is to, as I said, like make the synthesis and see what we can discover from it.
And one of the big topics that I'm less familiar with that you are especially familiar with is ufology. So I suppose, how did you get interested in that subject? And could you give us a very, as brief or as available to many people as you can, idea of what ufology consists of? Because I know it's
Certainly.
a very big subject.
So even though it looks like it's spelled like with an acronym, it's actually pronounced ufology. So I saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind when it came out in the theater. So to date myself, so it seemed like something that a young boy would be interested in at the time. So I learned about Project Blue Book, and my takeaway from Project Blue Book was that, oh, the U.S. government or the U.S. Air Force was investigating this stuff, so it must be real. But then I stopped pursuing any interest in that when it became clear that it wasn't socially acceptable. And I felt like it would be wise to try to be socially acceptable. So I didn't become aware of it again until that famous New York Times article in December 2017, where this particular U.S. government program or members of this government program came out and said, like, hey, we were investigating this stuff and it's real. So it's instantly my interest and a whole lot of other people's interest was rekindled, and we've now had a renaissance in ufology of sorts. Why is it interesting? Well, there's two reasons. Why is it interesting to me? It's different. The important thing is, why is it interesting to the public, I think. And there's two reasons. First of all, a lot of people see things in the sky that they can't explain. And yeah, a lot of those things aren't going to turn out to be anomalous vehicles, but a significant fraction of them are. Even more shocking is the encounters with otherworldly beings that make no sense, which are also like startlingly common. So there's all these people with all these compelling accounts of strange things that happen to them, and these are credible people. And then it's very clear that the U.S. government has had a very strong interest in this going back to the early 1950s or late 1940s. And that's well documented in documents from the government itself, which were obtained in the early 1970s under the Freedom of Information Act. So it's very clear that the government is concerned with this stuff and is investigating it, and is also attempting to muddle the public conversation of it, which makes it even more interesting. So the intel community and the military community have managed to attract maybe more attention to the issue than they intended to. But on the other hand, so many people see these things that you maybe have to attract attention if you want to muddy the waters, because otherwise enough people see them that academia would get interested, and then if academia started investigating, they might actually discover some things. So anyway, that's the short answer to a topic which is really difficult or complex.
Unfortunately, as soon as someone, even professional, depicts themselves as a ufologist, immediately conspiracy theorist tags are thrown on them, pseudoscience tags are thrown on them. Is that the kind of reaction that you found early on in your interest in ufology?
I admit, when the topic resurfaced, and I started like reading and watching everything I could find about it for a little while, and realizing, oh, this is actually absolutely real. I did feel a sense of discomfort in like raising it to people I didn't know, but I nonetheless like raised it to everybody I did know, and any number of people who I didn't know, to say like, look, this is real. And I'd never been interested before, but there's abundant evidence. The stigma is dying slowly. I don't think it will go away, because I don't actually think that academia, even though some of it wants to, is going to be able to get involved. This is really important. The U.S. government is not going to stop being interested in this issue, is not probably going to stop muddying the waters. It's not going to have a change of heart on, like, actually, we want the public to know what we know, and we want the public to know what's going on as we learn more. Like that doesn't seem likely to happen. So I think the possibility of clean academic work in this space is vanishingly small, and many academics will figure that out before they get very far in. And as a result, the topic will continue to live on the fringe, although maybe some more professional journalists will pick it up, because there's so many good witnesses to talk to, and there's so much public interest. It's a huge draw for online views. But yeah, I think we're going to remain in this muddled state for the foreseeable future.
So, what does the reality of UFOs and extraterrestrial beings, what does that imply for us as human beings? Because many will immediately, their minds will go straight to Independence Day or War of the World, some kind of alien takeover. What do you think are the implications?
It's really hard to know. It's pretty evident that there's been some kind of shamanic understanding of this going back centuries or millennia. So there's reason to think that some collection of these things, and there's a huge diversity of a phenomenon, and it's probably doesn't have one cause. But there's reason to believe this has been part of the human experience for hundreds of millennia, and there's no particular reason to think that it will change significantly now. There are periodic UFO flaps or waves in the Hudson Valley in the early 1980s. There was the famous 1997 Phoenix Lights event. There are periodic events where lots of people see them suddenly. There was the New Jersey drones thing, which who knows if that was actually all drones. I think because it's so hard to make sense of this, and because as a philosopher, my interest is in making sense of things so that we can like find tools for wisdom. I think this is probably the least important of the metaphysical phenomenon. And my advice to someone who comes in like close contact, like lights in the sky darting around, like, okay, it's not a big deal. But if you see a big light like on the ground, like not too far away, don't be curious about it. Don't go investigate. Turn around and put it out of your mind and walk away. Any number of people have received radiation burns, other kinds of injuries from these things. And there's a large number of people have had really traumatic encounters with unknown beings. And if you can avoid that, you want to. Now, many of these people couldn't have avoided it. Apparently, it was something they arranged to pre-birth or something, but like that. But if you have the option to ignore the UFO in the neighborhood, like I encourage you to ignore the UFO.
Talking about the US's interest in these phenomena, there's a number of different phenomena that allegedly the US took interest in, and especially one known one is their interest with the Monroe Institute Gateway process which investigated out-of-body perception and remote viewing, allegedly closed down due to finding lack of evidence of any phenomena, which I don't necessarily subscribe to as an explanation. What do you think about those programs?
The Monroe Institute is still running programs teaching people how to do out-of-body experience. I've heard testimony from any number of people who've done the program. It apparently works. It doesn't work the same way for all people. These are highly subjective experiences. They also did a program where people with particularly high ability to get out of body were working at exploring the cosmos, trying to interact with non-physical beings. That produced a series of tapes called the Explorer tapes, which I have only touched on. Personally, I have concerns about interactions with what you might generally call daimons. The daimon is a Greek term that basically means messenger, where someone has some kind of message or what's now called a download from some other realm that in some cases provides useful information, like here's how to create this kind of artwork. And in other cases provides some kind of literature about the nature of reality, like the Seth material. And I don't think we can know what the impact of a daimon or a messenger on any particular human mind is, whether it enhances their insight or clouds it. So I tend to be skeptical of material retrieved that way, because if you were going to do an empirical study of daimonic intelligence, you would want to send like a significant group of people over a long period of time to meet that same intelligence and try to get the same message. And that doesn't seem easy to do. So there might be something there to be explored down the road if that kind of work eventually gets more attention in academia. But for now, those are like interesting, like one-off data points, basically.
And one of the things that made me skeptical, especially about the Explorer series, was one, I believe it was Tom Campbell was in a communication with an entity called Thor, and came back with these predictions as to what was to come geopolitically and geographically, etc., with the natural disasters and such like that. None of which came to pass at all, which made me start to really question the legitimacy of the contact.
We have to be aware that there is this thing called the trickster phenomenon. The tricksters are part of the lore or part of the pantheon of many traditional cultures. In Native American cultures, you have the coyote. In Japanese culture, you have the kitsune, a fox spirit.
Nine-tailed fox. Mm.
So there is this apparently this category of being or category of behavior by non-physical beings that is designed to make human lives more complicated. They're not necessarily evil, although apparently they can be. But their aim seems to be to confuse, to complicate, to make things more challenging, which, like, they might be designed into the obstacle course that is, lifetimes on Earth. I don't know, but it's entirely possible that many of these daimonic encounters are actually encounters with tricksters, and so that's why they're getting information that doesn't end up checking out. Like, there's no question that people can get premonitions of events that do unfold. But yeah, we often get premonitions or information about events that don't unfold. So I wouldn't necessarily say that all came from Tom Campbell's subconscious, because he has a background with other kinds of vertical experiences where two out-of-body explorers came out of body at the same time and were able to exchange information, which they wouldn't have been able to exchange by any other means. Well, maybe
while they were separated in different isolation pods, isn't it? Mm.
Right. So I don't ever write off that any of these communications were not what they were said to be. I just don't think the information is necessarily actionable. And in some cases, the information is counterproductive. So the Seth material is famous for the perspective that you create your own reality. And that's a good soundbite. It copies from person to person easily. It sounds good, like I can take control of my reality, but that's just evidentially not the case. Like maybe collectively we all create our reality. That's certainly possible, but there's cases where people are evidently like affecting their reality, and then many other cases where people are like trying to do that and failing. So I don't think that the wisdom that we get from these sources is necessarily meant for all of humanity.
So you mentioned that something like ufology is one of the lower levels of importance in terms of your metaphysics. So what are some of the most important areas?
So yeah, by far the most important area is afterlife studies, which includes evidence for reincarnation, evidence for like a multi-layered afterlife experience, which is vastly more rich and unconstrained than here. And then secondarily, psi phenomena. And it seems like there's a lot of crossover between these things. Mediums always say that the way that they're receiving communication from spirits is through psychic ability, clairvoyance, clairsentience, clairaudience, etc.
From living people or from spirits?
From spirits. Well, some medium specifically refers to spirits. There is the case of the telepathy tapes, which documents people who have essentially overlapping consciousness, not simply like message passing by consciousness, but like a constant shared conscious state, like between parent and child or parent and caregiver. I think we can actually assume that was pretty common in Paleolithic times, when you're like deeply embedded in the natural world and deeply embedded with the rest of your tribe or family group. And so that kind of ability would be encouraged. And children seem to have this ability, this kind of sensitivity naturally early on in life. You could even argue that some of the way that we learn language is by telepathy. You know what the parent is saying when they're pronouncing the word. That's just a conjecture on my part. I'm not aware of any specific evidence for that, so I need to bracket that one. But so yeah, so the afterlife and psi phenomenon, which overlap a lot, of the two most important superphysical things to study, for which we have the most compelling evidence for. And I think shamanism is one of the next most important issues, because not only do these abilities come together in the shaman, but essentially every indigenous culture that so-called modern people have encountered throughout the world has had some kind of shamanism. We find it in Aboriginal Australia, in Africa, in the Americas, in Siberia. They all have different traditions, different legends, different cosmology, but they have many of the same abilities. Those abilities include herbalism, in some cases where they're receiving information directly from plants as to what to do for any particular condition. We have healing ability, which has now been separately documented in the medical literature and termed biofield healing. That's been effective, for instance, in curing certain kinds of cancer. Shamans are also mediums. They're connecting with the spirit world, ancestors, and nature spirits, for lack of a better term. They are telepaths and remote viewers, able to find lost people by using remote viewing skills to figure out where somebody might have gotten lost, where somebody might have become lost. So not that many scholars have looked deeply into shamanism and taken the shamans at their word as to what they were able to do, but those who have discovered this other world. And that's been done on many continents. So we don't have as much data about shamanism as we do about parapsychology and afterlife studies, but still it's a very significant phenomenon. And one of the reasons I like to highlight it is that if there was something that we could do as a society or as a community, it would be to rebuild our shamanic traditions. Because certain people are just born with abilities in this realm. Not everybody's born with the same level of each of the abilities. But oftentimes you submit the shaman to some kind of initiation process, which heightens those abilities significantly. And then any community is going to have multiple shamans who have different abilities. And like one of the reasons why we were able to thrive in the Paleolithic world with stone and wood tools and bone and animal skin based tools is that we had, for lack of a better word, magical powers.
Interesting. There's a lot of subjects to touch upon, including things like evolution and the kind of the metaphysics of that, which is one that I struggle with, because I am absolutely of the opinion that evolution is how the human being came to be. But I think that there was some form of intelligence at the very base of creating the last universal common ancestor, because just probabilistically, and in terms of the numbers that would be required, I spoke with Dr. Orson Wedgwood, who's a chemist who was very deeply involved in origin of life stuff, and from what he was telling me, it seems very, very, very unlikely, for want of a better term, that these initial molecules would have been able to generate on a proto-Earth environment. So I think that there must have been potentially some form of intelligence behind the initial catalyst for creating life, but that certainly human beings are a very evolved form of ape who all came from a common single-celled ancestor. What are your thoughts on that in terms of your metaphysics?
So before I address your point, which is important, I want to throw you a metaphysical curveball. I don't think it is possible for us to know how much of the reality we inhabit is simply four-dimensional artwork. So how many of the stars in the firmament have other beings around them that would, in a sense, make those places real? How much of the rock record, the paleontological rock record, was actually created by processes like we experience on the Earth every day now, and how much of that is just like part of the backdrop of our reality, the stage set. Now, I'm not saying that this is what I think, or that this is what the evidence shows, but I think it's a conjecture that we cannot rule out. So,
so just to clarify, so regarding kind of the nature of space, you're saying that how do we know that is what it appears to be and not some form of hologram or something? Is that what you mean?
Essentially, yes.
So what would be the argument for things like Voyager 1 and 2 that have been sent out to the outer edges of the solar system and things like that, and continue to travel?
In an environment where there's four-dimensional artwork, wherever you send sensors to look at things, it has to become real. But there's probably no reason to assume that it's all real. And one of the reasons to suppose that this might be the case is the Fermi paradox. The question by Enrico Fermi, where are all the advanced civilizations, since they should have already reached our solar system, long before we even evolved. And we don't see a lot of evidence, despite all the UFO evidence, which is all right here. We don't see apparently don't see a lot of evidence for non-human intelligence out in the cosmos. Now, it's not at all clear what that would look like. It wouldn't necessarily look like a super advanced technology. It's entirely possible that an advanced civilization develops their psychic ability and not their material technology, because that's really where all the action is. So that might account for that. So then all the visitors that we're seeing would be, interacting with us, through their spirit body or in some kind of astral projection form. Who knows? But it is worth at least pondering, how do we know that the reality we inhabit actually has the deep time dimension is real, as opposed to something that was created for us as a backdrop to a stage set. Not again, not that I believe that's the case, but
it's something that must be considered. And it sounds very much like the aspect of quantum mechanics that says everything is probability until measured.
I'm not sure that there's a lot of overlap between those perspectives, but yeah, there's some possibility from Bell's theorem that like reality, or like the quantum world, isn't in some sense real until measured. Anyway, that's a little above my pay grade. I try not to dabble in quantum physics or tie quantum physics to superphysical phenomena, because I don't think there's any evidence that they are related. But to your point about intelligence being necessary for evolution, yes, I think I agree with you that I mean, it seems clear to me that consciousness is part of the cosmos. In fact, maybe that the consciousness is all that the cosmos is. That maybe, like the fundamental ontology is, it's a collection of conscious beings without any physical form. And what that means is hard to conceptualize, and we're at the limits of the possibilities of understanding there. So, but yes, I think intelligence depends on consciousness, not the other way around. And in order for there to be a physical world of complexity, consciousness has to have some kind of involvement. There's a lot of questions about, like, could what we have on Earth have all entirely evolved here? Do we have a panspermia kind of situation where we were seeded from some other solar system that started before us? They're all open questions. But yeah, I don't see any reason to assume that consciousness like appeared in the evolutionary tree at some point. It must be eternal.
Sure. Okay. So moving on to the number one most important in your view, the afterlife studies, which I think are very important because, it's the one certain thing that we're all going to have to experience is the process of physical death. And I think it's essential that we understand what's to come, or at least get as close to an understanding as possible. And you mentioned as well that there are, was it 7 different lines of evidence within that framework?
Jeffrey Mishlove has identified 9 different lines, which not all of which I can remember off the top of my head in any given conversation.
Mm-hmm. And that was probably given within his Bigelow essay.
Indeed.
Can you remember the key ones from those?
Certainly, yeah. So we have near-death experiences, shared death experiences, childhood past life memories, mental and physical mediumship, particularly these days, mental mediumship. We have after death communications, messages from your loved ones from the beyond, spontaneously or in dreams.
Terminal lucidity.
Terminal lucidity is a mind-body relevant issue. It might pertain to the afterlife. I'm not sure if it's one of the 9, but it certainly seems related. Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts on each of those from your metaphysical your standpoint of empirical metaphysics, starting with near-death experiences?
So, the near-death experience is one of the most enriching things you can expose yourself to. So, I would recommend that every single person with an open mind or a curious mind listen to somebody's firsthand near-death experience account, like listen to somebody interviewed about it live or online, at least once a month, because they're just mind-blowing, and they're deeply moving, and it's very clear that all of these people have been like profoundly transformed by being in contact with this other realm and remembering it, even though they can't really put it in words. So in terms of applicable wisdom, which I'm after, like just receiving those stories from the people who experience them is one of the most beneficial things you can do in life. Not only to deal with your concerns about death, but to just situate yourself in the real cosmos, like as opposed to this strange culture, contrived culture that we inhabit that's been divorcing itself from like the real and superphysical worlds for hundreds of years or thousands of years. So yeah, that's how I feel about near-death experiences. There's like clearly a pattern there, even though each of them is like vastly different. There's indications that these realities have a texture that is subjectively or mentally responsive to one's unconscious inclinations or patterns or conscious patterns, which it helps explain why there's this consistent there are these consistent patterns, but like each experience is such
like
dramatically.
Christians will meet Jesus Christ, Japanese will cross on a boat rather than going through a tunnel, etc., which is very much in line as well with what I've seen. And one of the reasons why I was interested to experience myself an astral projection or an out-of-body experience is the report that the realms that they find themselves in, which they believe are the same as the afterlife realms, are incredibly malleable to one's imagination and to one's belief. Imagine a talking sentient rabbit and one appears before you, and you can hold a complete intelligent conversation with it, even to that level of detail. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that these afterlife realms are ontologically real, but subjectively determined, I suppose, at least in the way that they're experienced. But as you say, the most interesting thing to me about the near-death experience are the veridical perceptions, because that grounds it to me in reality. Whereas I can always find a reason or a paper that talks about brain chemistry relating to the subjective experiences, because that's not a provable thing. You can't prove something that's not of the world as effectively. So one could always argue that these are just imaginary events from a dying brain or a lack of oxygen or etc., etc. But the veridical aspects, where people come out of their body, see something in another room or another location entirely, and then which is later verified, especially if they were in a state where their brain should not have been able to produce any awareness, that then grounds it empirically in the world. And the only kind of argument I've seen against that is, well, that just never happened.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. So if you're ready to move on from that topic, the next most important thing to my mind is the childhood past life memories. We have thousands of accounts of children who have, like, from the earliest days when they could speak, are recalling memories of a previous life. And in many cases, like, the memories are traumatic and vivid. So the parent just assumes that these are dreams at first, and then realizes that something's going on with the child, and then takes the child in to get some kind of counseling or help, psychiatric help, because the child's clearly severely distressed. And any number of these cases that have been brought to the attention of professionals have turned into investigations where the child's memories are clearly of a documented person, and many of the memories can be nailed down to that other person's lifetime. So that's strongly compelling evidence for reincarnation. And then there's evidence for reincarnation in the near-death literature too. We find people like being able to review other of their lifetimes during the near-death state. So I think it's really important to know that, like, you have the option to come back. You'll maybe choose to come back even if you think you might not, from what you know of the world today. And I think those are important insights.
Following on from the past life memories, you mentioned as well shared death experiences. That's another area that I'm less knowledgeable of, but I've heard often touted as very important phenomena.
They're certainly less commonly reported, so it's hard to say how common they are, but pretty commonly a dying person will pull someone they know into the early stages of their afterlife transition. So the living human witnessing this will see other beings there to greet the the dying person. They'll see the other family members. They'll basically witness, this meeting place. I haven't heard nearly as many of these accounts as I have of NDEs. I have heard some particularly compelling ones. They are almost as transformative to the witness, the human witness, as they apparently are to the near-death experiencer. Because suddenly, like, you thrust into this other realm, and you realize that your loved one has like transitioned into this other realm, and that you'll see them again, like when you get there. So that has like a significant effective softening the impact of their death rather dramatically, and also like it suddenly changes your own understanding of the world that you're living in.
Sure. And I think one of the reasons I struggled to really kind of believe those as a ontologically real phenomenon is because I struggle with the idea that if one person accompanies the dying person to the afterlife and sees, if they both do see the same thing, only one person then returns to tell that story. So how do we then, we have no corroboration, so how do we then determine that that's a real experience?
Yes, off the top of my head, I think there are cases where multiple people have been pulled into the realm, but I don't remember any of those accounts specifically. But I agree with you. Yes, like corroboration is clearly a factor there. I think the best we can say is that these events seem to be real. These are credible witnesses who have obviously experienced some significant thing around the time of their loved one's passing. Yeah, they're not as evidential, I would agree, as the near-death experience literature or the childhood past life literature.
And so, what were the other phenomena you mentioned as
mediumship?
Mediumship, which is quite a dirty word in science these days, because it's all considered fraud at the worst possible level.
Yeah, there certainly is. Was and is a lot of fraud in that department. But if you look at humanity, human culture as a whole, like fraud is everywhere. Every type of profession commits fraud, like frequently. So there's no reason to hold mediumship to a higher standard. If there was some kind of institution that was in charge of testing and authorizing mediums, I mean, there are informal ones, but there's nothing like academia where you go through this rigor of a PhD in order to become a professor. So yeah, that would be better, but that doesn't prevent academic fraud, obviously. It probably limits it significantly, though. So, but leaving the fraud aside, there's two groups, Wind River and the Forever Family Foundation.
Windbridge.
Windbridge, thank you.
Windbridge.
Thank you.
Julie Byshell.
Yeah. And I forget the people involved in Forever Family, but Liz has had them on her show many times. Oh, we
Mark
didn't mention
Bacuzzi? I can't remember.
Yes, I think so.
Liz.
Just for the viewers, Liz Enton is a podcaster who does a show called WTF Just Happened. It's a podcast which interviews mediums and near-death experiencers predominantly, and other people, in related fields. She's a wonderful podcaster because she comes at this with like wanting the evidence perspective, which most people doing metaphysical podcasts like don't really do. They just assume it's all probably real in some way. But anyway, so mediumship. So yeah, there are these groups that test mediums. They're so rigorous in how they test mediums that they turn away a lot of actual mediums who don't perform well under scrutiny, which is completely, understandable. Like stage fright, right? But given this smaller, portion of mediums who can pass their tests, then it's very clear that they're getting information that has to have come from the person who's passed away. So that's again been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and I'm not interested in debating it.
Okay, and we did mention it briefly, so we'll just finish off with, I suppose, terminal lucidity and your thoughts on that.
Well, that's an interesting one. It implies that in order to control the body, you don't always need the brain. And to my understanding, like that, very large fraction of what the brain is actually doing is not thinking, but controlling the body, organizing the production of speech, of managing the hands, doing intricate dexterity tasks, of walking, of running, of dancing, of planning, activities for the day, like planning them in a sense of like I'm physically going to do this and that and the other thing, like setting up a movement path in a sense. So is that suddenly suddenly the brain isn't necessary for that? Like apparently, the spirit world can just take over in the physical world and do arbitrary things, um, which we see actually in shamanism pretty often, and in some other like poltergeist phenomena. Although a lot of those are tied not to disembodied spirits, but to actual people in that environment. It's just that they're doing things non-physical, super physically, without intention. But back on the terminal lucidity, like the implications of that are just like shocking, because he calls into question everything we presume about physical causality from the natural sciences, that energy does work across time, and apparently you don't need a system to process energy to do work across time in the terminal lucidity case. So, like, who knows what's going on there? It could be an anomalous healing event, but it's clearly not permanent healing because the person then dies shortly afterwards. So, totally inscrutable.
And as I asked as well in an email to you, which I found interesting as well, your idea on near-death experiences and the brain as a filter hypothesis. Many would take both near-death experiences and terminal lucidity as evidence that the soul, spirit, whatever you want to call it, consciousness, is somehow separating from or becoming less and less dependent on the physical brain. And with terminal lucidity, would say that it's becoming free of the damaged filter of the brain to become more sentient, back to how it was when the brain was doing what it was supposed to be doing. What do you think about those perspectives?
Yes, but it's able to control the body because the person is speaking with their vocal cords, right? With their normal verbal apparatus, and they're sitting up and they're moving around and they're looking at people, and so they're obviously like physically engaged with the physical world and with their loved ones. And the loved ones are clearly not hallucinating that. So what's going on? As far as the filter model goes, this is a really popular one because it's easy for people to relate to. Just like a radio, like tunes in the airwaves and demodulates the signal and provides this nice music. That's fine as kind of a stepping stone, but when you actually look at the physical reality as we understand it from physics and chemistry, the brain is dependent on the body, is dependent on the ecosystem, is dependent on the world, is dependent on the solar system, etc. So there isn't a brain per se. It's not a self-contained or self-cohesive system. There's just a physical universe. Like if there's if you're going to like circumscribe a coherent system, it's the physical universe. And so, but all of our interactions with the physical universe are through our perception. Like that's the only way we know the physical universe, is that we perceive it, and we have intersubjective agreements about what we perceive. I see, this color on this side of the thing. You see that color. We turn the thing around. Now I see the color you saw, vice versa. So great. There is an intersubjective reality, but that's not the same as an objective reality. So you have to posit that the physical universe is a collective intersubjective construction. Now, obviously, it's a construction by unconscious intent, if intent at all, or it's an unconscious construction. But if it is a construction, it's not something we're like really trying to do. So like this gets to the limits of our capacity to conceptualize in embodied form, like pretty suddenly. Like there just isn't any way to know what the heck matter is, and there isn't any way to know what mind is, because that's what we are. And it's like, how do you hold a mirror up to the mind?
It's like trying to look at your trying to look at your own eyes with your eyes.
Exactly. I mean, you can do meditation, and that yields insights, but it's not clear to me that meditation is like is taking into like an afterlife state. Like people get in meditation, people get into this like perception of the void, and this is just a conjecture. I have no evidence for this, but it's possible that the void that they're experiencing is what we call the veil, the layer, the boundary between us and the rest of reality that prevents us from seeing spirits, for example. So yeah, you would expect that if you stopped perceiving the physical world through a meditative state, that everything would go blank. But in a near-death experience, that's not what happened. You're not suddenly in this empty oneness that feels comfortable or blissful or whatever. You're suddenly in this reality where there's all these other beings. So like that's not what, like people in meditative states will sometimes encounter beings apparently showing up in the physical world. That's a different thing. But so yes, it's the mind-body interface is hard to puzzle out.
And one of the suggestions for that is that during a near-death experience, the brain's braking mechanisms, as Sampania calls them, which focus the beam of consciousness into the physical world, are breaking down or are not functioning due to whatever ailment that the near-death experiencer is having physically. And so is not able to put that veil across, and that it's the brain that's limiting our perception so that we can survive in the physical world without the noise of the non-physical. And more esoterically, people would argue that we also go through a veil of forgetting where we're from so that we can experience this life as a learning mechanism, as if here for the first time. What do you think about those ideas?
I'm not familiar with the idea you just described about the like a more evidence for the filter. So I will like defer that and do some more research. As far as, sorry, I lost the other point.
Regarding the veil of forgetting that we go through.
Right. This is really important. So there's kind of three veils. There's forgetting. There's the veil that prevents us from like seeing the rest of reality, and there's the ego, which apparently like accumulates over time. It's not something you're completely born with. There's some like thin layer there that pieces of culture and relationships start to accumulate on. So yes, we appear to be like under a heavy boundary, or within each of us within a heavy or a dense boundary with respect to other beings. We experience other beings, other physical beings at least, sometimes non-physical beings, but our capacity to like understand them, communicate with them is extremely limited. There's an interesting like contrast to consider, like from the telepathy tapes, these folks who have basically real difficulty at what's called apraxia, difficulty controlling their bodies. So they're apparently, their consciousness is not fully, if you will, connected to the body. Who knows if that's the case, but they're able to have these like shared consciousness states with other people who aren't inhabiting that same difficulty state. So there's an example of like a diffuse boundary between beings, as opposed to the really dense boundary that we're accustomed to. And apparently in the afterlife realm, from the NDE literature, you suddenly have like high bandwidth, like full fidelity communication ability with all the beings you encounter, because like communication is instantaneous and you get not only what they meant to say, but also the context for it. and all the responses that they might have, depending on like what you might say, and like you suddenly understand like all of their perspective about whatever you're conversing about. So like just a dramatically different state of being, which apparently like there are still boundaries because there are still separate beings. People still recognize themselves as individuals with particular interests or relationships anyway. But this like dramatically different like way of relating to the other beings in the environment. Super fascinating.
And I wonder how that works for animal consciousness as well, wild animal and pets and things like that. Because most of the world religions especially see humans as special and separate from the animal kingdom, whereas I certainly don't believe that.
Yes, I will say that jokingly, I see humans as special. We are especially handicapped. We are perhaps the least conscious form of life on the planet. And now that's maybe the wrong thing to say. We are the most boundaried. I'll say that. We're the most boundary consciousness on the planet. Now that's impossible to prove out. So that's just a conjecture. But my conjecture is that the more you are able to manipulate the physical world and to construct mental concepts or objects, the more likely you are to be like absorbed in the physical world and that you're manipulating, and the mental objects that you're crafting, and then as a result from lack of practice be cut off or heavily boundaried from, except through the like established verbal mechanism from all the other beings. So and with animal consciousness, like I don't think there's any reason why humans in a transcendent state wouldn't have shared consciousness with animals too. I mean, we have the clear evidence that dogs, for instance, are telepathic with their owners, or some dogs are. Thank you, Rupert Sheldrake.
Dogs who know when their owners are coming home.
Yeah, right. So I think we can maybe assume that the animal world has a more diffuse boundary state with each other, maybe not with all other beings, but at least with the other beings that they need to connect with. I like to observe that certain cats seem to spend all the time meditating. So why wouldn't they maybe be the most spiritual animals on the planet? But no evidence of that, just the happy conjecture.
But they were also revered by the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians.
For what it's worth, indeed.
Okay, let's move on to the human sciences in terms of your empirical metaphysics.
So there's a bunch of stuff that people aren't really aware of about humanity, which is almost equally ontologically shocking as the superphysical. And the things that are like most salient from my point of view, for the sake of a short conversation, are the state that humanity entered after the Paleolithic, when humanity began farming, and the state that we're in now or transitioning to. So there is this very clear evidence in European genomes of a what you might call a genocide event around 5,000 years ago. We know from the genetic evidence and from the archaeological evidence that this group that's now called the Yamnaya, who were native to the steppes of Western Eurasia, what is now Western Russia and Ukraine, apparently began migrating into Central Europe and systematically wiping out all of the men and children in all the settlements they came across, and enslaving the women, because we have evidence that the cultures, the Y chromosomes of the cultures that had been there, the farming cultures that had originated in the Near East thousands of years before, the Y chromosomes like vanish for a period of time. And yet we still have evidence of the mitochondrial DNA, which indicates that a large chunk of the women survive. So this is interpreted as a likely genocide event. So beginning actually before then, to be fair to the people who committed that atrocity, maybe 2,000 years before that, we have good evidence for systematic warfare in Europe, in the population that had migrated from the Near East doing farming. So between, say, 7,000 and 5,000 years ago, humanity enters this state of endemic warfare and slavery. And we have been there ever since. And modern people don't realize this because of a not so simple but brilliant invention, nuclear weapons. We stopped having large-scale wars between major powers 70 years ago. And we're still having large-scale wars, see the invasion of Ukraine. But there is this impression among people in the developed world that we live in a more or less peaceful world, which is not the correct impression. But when you look back in the recorded history and prehistory, we have this dark, dark legacy of systematic violence and or what you could call endemic existential conflict and systematic exploitation of people for labor. I still haven't recovered from the ontological shock of realizing that our civilization has transformed itself via this process of warfare and slavery. There is this perception among modern people that this began, when Europe began colonizing the rest of the world, and that's just not true. Certainly that happened, and Europeans were terrible in the process, but they were the product of terrible cultures going back thousands of years. And an academic named Luke Kemp has recently been speaking about this. He wrote a book about how when you start farming and accumulating resources that are attractive to raid, that some people start to make a lifestyle out of raiding. So in terms of understanding like the purpose of human lives, this is really important to understand because it's really in dramatic contrast with what we hear about from the near-death context, where you're suddenly like immersed in a realm of love, where beings are obviously like deeply warm and compassionate towards each other. And I literally like cannot, like trying to make a synthesis of these two facts is, it's just baffling, like on an existentially baffling. But we have to try, and we have to consider like what that could mean that life is, because it's obviously not meant to be a utopia. It's obviously not meant to be. I mean, if the spirit world has causal power in the physical world, if our ancestors, if trickster spirits, if spirit guides, if these non-physical or semi-physical interdimensional beings or aliens, or whatever you want to call them, if they all have causal power here, then it's possible that the living humans on the planet at the moment really don't have much say in how this is going, or only limited say. I wrote an essay about this on my blog, which is titled "Whither, Will, and Freedom," about the contrast between freedom of choice and the deep will. But to come to the point, like, what can we say about the purpose of lifetimes, given that the lifetimes we're going to be living in this environment are shockingly difficult, where many people are subjected to like unbelievable cruelty, where other people are going to like apparently sign up to perpetrate such cruelty. Like you don't have one without the other. The things that are doing the terrible things here are not like mechanical processes. There are other beings living lifetimes. So what in the world is going on? And you also have to contrast these two circumstances with what we know about the Paleolithic, where people are apparently living in a much more communitarian environment with far lower populations. They're exchanging young people with other nearby or even far away groups regularly, because you need to keep a small population mixing in order to keep it genetically viable. So you need to be at peace with the groups near you and the groups near them, and so on. So you're trading people, you're trading goods across long distances in that world. It seems to be, I mean, it's not an easy life, certainly, but it seems to be a relatively peaceful world, which is in deep harmony with the biophysical world and also the superphysical world. Like, they have shamans who are in contact with the ancestors, and shamanic abilities are not like confined to just the people who are the endowed shamans or initiated shamans. Like, lots of people have some level of those powers. So I don't know how to square these three like radically different environments: the Paleolithic, the era of warfare and slavery that happens after the Neolithic, and the afterlife world.
I'd imagine many would argue that if you remove that third level of the afterlife realms and the spiritual altogether, then you have a very cohesive argument that this is all just a result of human development over time from a material basis.
Yeah, but we can't. Like, we know that that realm is real, that it's probably more real than real life. Like, I appreciate that like skeptical questions are necessary, but there's no question that the superphysical phenomena that have been studied by scholars have been verified. So, so clearly something weird is afoot here. So then there's one other like major trend from the human sciences that that is worth digging into, and that is what we call the metacrisis. The metacrisis is the collection of intractable and interlocking problems that we have in modern society, which, as far as I can tell, well, are a product of two things: the size of the population and the per capita consumption of that population. But there's of course other issues like inequality, and artificial intelligence creating disinformation, et cetera, et cetera. But the people who have looked deeply into the metacrisis, starting in the 1970s with a work called Limits to Growth, have concluded that on the trajectory that we've been on for 50 years, well, no longer, for a couple hundred years, on the trajectory that we've been on, the population will peak and then crash. And it appears that we are now at the point where the population has peaked, and we are at the outset of the crash. We're past the tipping point. Past the tipping point, and there is nothing we can do to prevent it. In order to like actually arrest our production of CO2 and other pollutants, we would have to do something like incredibly radical, like ban all non-essential airline travel and ration fuels and other carbon-intensive materials, abolish animal agriculture, and a list of other, like do some kind of make some kind of effort to limit the birth rates. Just a whole bunch of things that human populations in democracies would never accept. And honestly, like China decided to limit their birth rates, and they've created a different kind of catastrophe. So you can't realize the changes that we need to realize either in a democratic society or in an authoritarian one. So we are basically committed to this path of going over the cliff. In fact, it's pretty clear we have already gone over the cliff, and we are accelerating gradually towards the bottom. So
and what's just briefly, what's driving this population crash? Climate issues.
Climate, yeah, predominantly climate. We're going to see a significant fall in agricultural production. In the developed world, because of inequality and the internet, we're already seeing falling birth rates. Obviously not for agricultural production regions, but like eventually this starts to spiral, and you have declining agricultural productivity, declining population, declining industrial productivity, declining availability of products, rapidly rising prices. falling birth rates, you get this this feedback loop, which ends in a very, very much smaller population in a relatively small amount of time. By the middle of the century, we can expect like a significant reduction in the population, but it will fall by at least a quarter, and maybe much more. And we just can't even like comprehend what that means for jobs and for life, for any part of life. A whole lot of things that we.
So if we're currently at 8 billion, is it 8 billion population we're at now?
8.8 maybe.
So approaching now, so we're talking 2 and a bit billion people by the mid-century, decreased in terms of population.
Yes, and I think that's conservative. I think it's more likely to be much deeper, but I don't want to go out on a limb. The conservative estimates are like, yeah, we're going to lose a quarter of the population, and this is not just in the developed world. Like this will happen across the globe, at different degrees in different places. Like India is in real trouble with climate. So it appears that we are at the beginning of some kind of very unusual transition, so on a scale not seen since the Black Death in Europe. Now, the Black Death killed a huge chunk of the population much more quickly, like within a space of a few years, and this is going to apparently go more slowly than that, hopefully. But it's important to stress this because among the techno-optimists and among the metaphysical optimists, there's this sense that we're about to emerge into some kind of new world, some new like spiritual awakening or new technological augmentation driven awakening. And I don't think there's evidence for either of those things. Yes, there's evidence that there's more interested in spirituality because of podcasts like this. 2 thumbs up. And there's evidence for increasing technological augmentation ability that's shown great strides, but it looks like we're actually at the start of a very serious crash, which is going to change our civilization dramatically. And it's possible that gives an opportunity for the development of a shamanic class, which would then help us reconnect with our ancestors and the superphysical world, which would be of huge benefit. But it's very hard to predict the future, and I wouldn't want to say like, oh, that's definitely going to happen, because I have no idea what's going to happen. It's going to be intense, though.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of sources, including the Ra material, which I mentioned earlier, the Law of One stuff, which is kind of the only text of that type that I've ever read. So it's the only reference I have. But apparently many others as well do talk about us entering kind of a new era from like the year 2012 or so onwards. And one does wonder whether the climate catastrophes that are likely to take place and the resulting drop in or just change in the way life is, whether that is from a spiritual point of view a necessary thing for us to really become aware of it. Maybe we've gone too far away from that side of life that something needs to happen to bring us back into connection with it. From an optimistic point of view, perhaps that's the catalyst that will bring us up into the next level of consciousness or whatever that means.
It's hard for me to see how, just given the evolution of beings, of physical beings, and the evolution of culture, how you get out of the mindset of endemic warfare and slavery. Because that's deeply woven into both our genes at this point and our cultures. Look at the number of people who call themselves spiritual warriors. Wait, a warrior is a trained killer because you need them in order to defend your society from other trained killers. So don't use the term warrior when you're talking about spirituality. But it's so deeply woven in our culture that warrior is just assumed to be like a positive thing. So it's hard to predict the future, and probably anything can happen. And you could see like a cultural transformation that could ripple across the population. And suddenly people would start doing spiritual practices that were actually effective as opposed to socially and politically advantageous. Who knows? And it's possible that we just get reset to a smaller population and like find some different kind of culture in that context, or that we end up rebuilding, a civilization with different technology. It's very hard to say. But it is a much smaller population, and there is a metaphysical implication in that, is that there's less spots for reincarnating beings. So potentially, the vast majority of us, by the end of the century, will be incarnating somewhere else.
Or even at a different level.
So this gets into hard to validate stuff, but what's the name? Christian Sundberg, I think.
Pre-life memories.
Yes. So intermission, what's called intermission memories, like a life between lives. He has like a collection of really interesting memories that he retrieved consciously, like not via hypnotic regression, through a traumatic experience he had. And he talks about different kinds of realities that are not physical, or not physical in the way that ours is, but that are comprehensive. Like you're living in a world, you're living, with other beings in an ecosystem, but you have more awareness of where you came from and what you're there for. Like it's not an Earth school, as far as I can tell, because we don't know what we're here to learn, and we don't get sent home for lunch, or we don't get lunch every day, and we don't even get to go home at the end of the day anyway.
We don't get to make it easier for ourselves when it gets tough.
Right. So it's and there's other accounts of this in the metaphysical literature, which again, like hard to verify. So the evidence is not very good, but some of the near-death experiences do recall that people do have recollections of, I was living in a different kind of reality. I was incarnated as a different kind of being on a different kind of world where, like things worked entirely differently. So
there are also the Michael Newton books, if you're familiar with those.
Yes, I have read that. Yes, or the first one. I didn't find that entirely compelling, because in order for something like that to be compelling to me, like it needs to be acquired by different investigators at different times with different populations. So it's entirely possible that any number of people that he talked to experienced those exact things, but it's impossible to say whether that's a representative fraction of the population.
Especially when they're under such a state that is so open to suggestion from the person doing the therapies. Yeah.
To what extent? It's not so much that the therapist might give verbal suggestions, as to what extent is the patient and the therapist's like consciousness or unconscious like overlapping during that session, and they're exchanging information without knowing it. Like people get a lot of things by apparently superphysical or telepathic means that they just don't know where it came from, and it just occurred to them, and it works, so they go with it. So, but anyway, so it does seem at least plausible that there are other kinds of realities which aren't physical in the way this reality is. It could be on other planets in this physical universe, or more likely, in other kinds of physical environments altogether. So yes, but the point is that in terms of a population crash, I guess if we're going to be reincarnating, we're going to be reincarnating in some other kind of environment. Which sounds good to me, honestly.
Yeah. I think this planet we've made a big mess of, unfortunately, for everybody else other than humans and non-humans alike. Which is
you have to consider the Gaia hypothesis when going down that track. The Gaia hypothesis is the idea that Earth is self-regulating, and the things that happen on the Earth are subject to regulation by the Earth. Now, whether the Earth is a conscious being or not, that's not part of the Gaia hypothesis. Could be, doesn't have to be. But it posits the Earth as a self-regulating system, a cohesive system that's fed by the sun, but it's also fed by internal energy as well. But so that seems plausible, and it is entirely possible that Gaia created humanity for some particular purpose. Maybe that purpose had something to do with warming the planet. And Gaia is now done with humanity, so it is pushing it back down to, a tenable level, not necessarily extincting us, but reducing the population to something that's, sustainable long term, like it's several tens of million or a billion or something. Again, all conjecture, but the Gaia hypothesis rests on a bunch of decent evidence, so worth considering.
So I suppose to wrap up, what are you hoping to achieve with sharing the empirical metaphysics, and where can people find your work?
So I'm writing a blog. All the data, all my writing is free on this blog. It's patreon.com/networkimprov. Link is hopefully in the description. So what am I hoping to accomplish? Well, fundamentally, I can only make so much progress on this myself. This needs to be a collective effort. So I'm at a disadvantage not being an academic myself, but I'm putting out a call to academics who have an interdisciplinary mindset and an openness to the reality of the superphysical. Let us create in the human sciences a new discipline, which I don't know what to call it. I would suggest we call it empirical metaphysics, but you could call it something else. But there is a need to do this kind of synthesis, and to confront what we really are and what we might be here to learn and do. Another important point about that is that a large chunk of near-death experiencers in their life review are confronted with the things that they did to uplift others during their lifetime as being the most valuable things that they did, way more valuable than any of the things they achieved. So that's part of the applicable wisdom that we might derive, that being good, being kind, being there for people we care about, and learning to care about more people is one of the lessons we can take from this. So, but we need a new discipline to look at all this data and do a synthesis and try to come up with new wisdom tools for humanity, or at least for individual cultures.